Part CAT oxygen requirements. Supplemental oxygen is used to provide people on board with oxygen during a cabin depressurization. Survival oxygen is the oxygen supplied to the aeroplane occupants in case of accidental depressurization. The purpose of the first aid oxygen is to provide some passengers with additional respiratory assistance after an emergency descent following a depressurization. In a pressurized aircraft, the first aid therapeutic oxygen is designed to give medical assistance to passengers with pathological respiratory disorders. A jet aircraft is certified for the carriage of 120 passengers. 42 passengers are on board, and the expected flight level en route is flight level 330. The first aid oxygen to be on board at departure shall provide breathing supply for at least one passenger for the entire flight after cabin depressurization at cabin altitudes of more than 8,000 feet. A public transport aircraft has a cruising altitude of flight level 390. It is fitted with the individual oxygen mask for the passengers. In the event of a depressurization, the masks must be automatically released before the cabin pressure altitude exceeds 15,000 feet. In accordance with Part CAT, when an aeroplane flies at over 25,000 feet, the total number of dispensing units and supply terminals must be at least greater than the number of seats by 10%. An aircraft is scheduled to fly from Paris to Marseille at flight level 390 and has the following characteristics. Maximum permissible number of passengers specified by the Certificate of Airworthiness, 230. Number of seats on board, 200. The scheduled number of passengers on board, 180. The minimum number of inhaler systems provided in the aircraft should be 220. This is 10% greater than the number of seats on board. A public transport aircraft is intended to be operated at flight level 390. The total number of oxygen masks, dispensing units and outlets, in the cabin must be at least the same as the total number of seats, exceeded by 10%. A public transport jet aeroplane may be operated up to flight level 450. The cabin includes 180 passenger seats, made up of 30 rows, 3 seats for each side of the central aisle. The minimum number of cabin oxygen masks for this aeroplane must be 198. That's 10% extra on those 180 seats. Supplemental oxygen Part CAT requirements for pressurized aircraft. Flight crew. The supply for all occupants of flight deck seats on duty is dependent upon the duration and cabin pressure altitude achieved. It shall be the entire flight time when the cabin pressure altitude is greater than 13,000 feet. The entire flight time minus 30 minutes when 10,000 feet or less than 13,000 feet about cabin pressure altitude, and in no case less than 30 minutes for aeroplanes certificated to fly altitudes not exceeding 25,000 feet, and 2 hours for aeroplanes certificated to fly above 25,000 feet. All required cabin crew members, the duration and cabin pressure altitudes are entire flight time when the cabin pressure altitude is greater than 13,000 feet but not less than 30 minutes, and the entire flight time minus 30 minutes when above 10,000 feet and less than 13,000 feet cabin pressure altitude. Supplemental oxygen requirements, pressurized aircraft, passengers. There should be supply for 100% of the passengers for the entire flight time when the cabin pressure altitude exceeds 15,000 feet, but in no case less than 10 minutes. There shall only be a requirement for supply for 30% of the passengers when the entire flight time is above 14,000 feet and below 15,000 feet cabin pressure altitude, and only 10% of the passengers for the entire flight time minus 30 minutes when the cabin pressure altitude is above 10,000 and less than 14,000 feet. In accordance with Part CAT, the minimum requirement for the survival oxygen needed to supply all of the passengers during and following an emergency descent is 10 minutes, or the entire flight time where the cabin pressure altitude is above 15,000 feet, whichever is the greater. For the flight crew members, quickly fitted oxygen masks, quick donning types, are compulsory on board any pressurized aircraft flying greater than 25,000 feet. Above flight level 410, one pilot must wear an oxygen mask at all times during commercial flights. The time of useful consciousness for an explosive decompression at 40,000 feet is only 12 seconds. A warning device alerts the crew in the case of an excessive cabin altitude. This warning must be triggered on reaching 10,000 feet cabin altitude. Following an explosive decompression, if you're using the oxygen diluted demand system, the regulator controls the amount of air that is mixed with pure oxygen when the supply selector is at the normal position. At approximately 32,000 feet, the regulator supply to the mask becomes pure oxygen only. For passengers' oxygen in public transport aircraft, information must be given to passengers through a demonstration. If a flight has to be carried out at flight level 290, this demonstration must be completed before takeoff. An airline plans to operate a pressurized aircraft at flight level 240 on its whole route with 150 passengers on board. Regarding the regulatory requirements about oxygen, the aircraft will be equipped with a warning system for indicating that the cabin altitude is higher than 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet. The quantity of oxygen on board will be sufficient for the supply of all of the occupants during the whole flight time above flight level 150 after an eventual depressurization. The minimum requirement for supplemental oxygen to be supplied in depressurized aeroplanes during and following an emergency descent are that for pilots, it shall be available for the entire flight time that the cabin pressure altitude exceeds a minimum of 13,000 feet. On board a pressurized aircraft, a flight shall be undertaken only if the aircraft is provided with an oxygen reserve, enabling all the crew members and part of the passengers to be supplied with oxygen in the event of a cabin depressurization throughout the flight period during which the pressure altitude is greater than 10,000 feet. Supplemental oxygen Part CAT requirements, non-pressurized aircraft. The supply shall be for all occupants of flight deck seats on flight deck duty for the entire flight time at pressure altitudes above 10,000 feet. The supply shall be for all required cabin crew members for the entire flight time at pressure altitudes above 13,000 feet and for any period exceeding 30 minutes at 10,000 feet and below 13,000 feet. With regard to the passengers, all of the passengers shall have supply for the entire flight time at pressure altitudes above 13,000 feet. 10% of passengers shall have supply for the entire flight time after 30 minutes at pressure altitudes greater than 10,000 feet but not exceeding 13,000 feet. Each occupant of the flight deck seats on duty in a non-pressurized aircraft must have an oxygen supply reserved for the entire flight time at pressure altitudes greater than 10,000. 100% of the passengers in a non-pressurized aircraft must have an oxygen supply reserved for the entire flight time at pressure altitudes greater than 13,000. On board a non-pressurized aircraft, the crew and all of the passengers must therefore be fed with oxygen throughout the flight period during which pressure altitude is greater than 13,000 feet.